The authorities are minorities at my water.
This video was made possible by my patrons, Joshua Bartlett, Scorch88, Drew Cavallo, Thomas Frost, Jacob Pelletier, James Schubach, Gomicide, Victor Cage, Douglas Smith, Capitalism is Good, Pipsqueak, Michael, Lady Cthulhu, and Snizzy Poo. Thank you so much to all of you. Today's video was selected on the basis of a Twitter poll. Check my Twitter profile every Sunday to vote for Tuesday's video on My 2 Cents. Hello everyone, this is My 2 Cents, and today I'm going to be talking about the alt-right's view of nationalism, and why I think it is both misguided and ultimately unachievable. At least, not without establishing a totalitarian state, exactly like the one the left seeks to establish. I'll also finish off by explaining why I think if you're alt-right, you should really consider becoming an ANCAP, or at least a libertarian instead. I'll be looking at a video put out by Lauren Rose called Nationalism. Now, as many of you know, Lauren Rose has previously been the recipient of a video in my Beauty and Brain series. I think she has had a lot of good things to say in many of her videos. However, as of late, her content on YouTube and Twitter has become almost exclusively about demographics and nationalism from an alt-right perspective. I will not be taking her Beauty and Brains video down, and I have no ill will towards Lauren Rose. However, I do disagree with her on this issue, and I think it's worth explaining why. Let's get into it.
It's been a while since we've last talked, but today I'm going to teach you a little bit about nationalism and why I consider it my credo of sorts. On the right, there are a lot of people who pose as nationalists who clearly misunderstand the term. I'll give them the benefit of the doubt and say that they just misunderstand it when they call themselves nationalists. And I believe it is very important to know, it's vital to know the difference between someone who really is a nationalist and who isn't. In the most reductive sense, nationalism is the desire to preserve your nation. This only makes sense because how can you have nationalism without a nation? The word nation, the Latin root of the word is natio, which literally means people, race. It is a people of common history, common birth, common race, common culture, common language. These are the things that make up a nation.
All right. Off the bat, I don't necessarily disagree with anything she said. However, I'd like to point out that nations, as she's defined them, are not some kind of everlasting metaphysical entity set in stone. Over time, races, peoples, cultures, languages, and all the individual elements she's just listed change. Further, must a person share all of these elements, or just some of them in order to be part of a nation? There are nations that once existed but no longer do, and potentially there could be nations that have yet to exist but will in the future. Whether we're talking about America, Britain, Germany, Japan, these are all nations that have developed from previous nations. Over time, people have migrated from one place to another, taking various traditions with them, and often mixing them with other traditions they pick up along the way, which in turn can lead to the rise of new nations altogether. No nation is entirely unique or set apart from the others. All nations inevitably evolve, be it racially, culturally, or otherwise.
There's only one thing to do. Learn the language of the fleas, earn their trust, then breed with their women. And in time, our differences will be forgotten.
I believe it is very important that I tell you what the difference between a nation and a state are, because people often use them in place of another, and they are not the same thing. The state is a sovereign governing body over a defined territory with defined borders. That is a state. The United States is a state. France is a state. Canada is a state. Algeria is a state. I think you get the point. There are three major types of relationships between a nation and a state. First, you have a multinational state, which is a state that encompasses more than one nation, more than one peoples. That would be like the United States. Here we have, it is one state, but we have many nations of people living within our state. France, Canada has many nations of people within its state. So that is what a multinational state is. Next, you have a stateless nation, which would be a nation of people who don't have a state of their own. That would be like the Palestinians, and until the middle of the 20th century, the Jews. Now, the third important relationship to know is a nation state. And a nation state is a state that encompasses only one nation of people. That would be like Japan, where most of the people in Japan are Japanese, or Iceland, or even Poland. Does that sound familiar to you? A state that encompasses just one nation? That's right, ethnostate. That is the word that people like to throw around here. Ethnostate, which is really just a nation state, a state for one nation of people.
Once again, I don't have anything to dispute here. I fully agree that a state and a nation are not the same thing, and a state is not necessary for a nation to exist. However, I would like to point out that the state itself, and particularly the ideas espoused by the state, can have quite the degree of influence over a nation. Let's just use Japan as an example. Like Lauren said, Japan would be an example of a nation-state or an ethno-state, in that the vast majority of the people who live there are ethnically Japanese. However, have you considered how different Japan looks today than it did prior to World War II? From 1945 to 1952, Japan was occupied by the Allied powers, specifically the US. The Japanese emperor lost all real power, becoming merely a symbol of the state, and a parliamentary system mirroring Western governments was instituted. Further, economic policies began to mirror those in the West as well. Today, if you visit Japan, the people are still ethnically Japanese, but aside from that, there are a great deal of similarities with otherwise Western culture. The US still maintains numerous military bases across Japan as well. Does this mean Japan is a Western nation? No, it's still unique, but my point is the Japanese people look substantially different than they did prior to World War II. I strongly suspect if we could go back in time and take a very traditionally minded Japanese man from pre-World War II Japan and take him to see modern Japan, he would probably be disgusted with what he saw and would not consider it to be the true Japanese nation.
So, ethno-nationalism is a redundant term because the nation and nationalism has everything to do with the identity of the people, which includes race and ethnicity. Common birth is a big part of the nation, as well as culture, language, other things like that, which can be adopted, but you can't have one or two and not the other. If you're not of common birth, you can never be a part of that nation.
I am going to dispute that particular notion, but I'll let her explain herself further before I do.
The civic nationalist, or faux nationalist, I might go back and forth between those terms, is not concerned with preserving race, ethnicity, culture. They are mostly concerned with preserving shared ideals.
I don't care if the United States is 80% brown in 30 years, as long as they're pro-gun, pro-family, want to go to the stars, want to have freedom, and don't want to be slaves. And we need to get past what color we are and adopt a system of ideas.
They believe that through shared ideals, they can preserve the way of life they love so much without the nation that built it.
Now, as I've previously pointed out in my video, Race, Ideas, and Meritocracy, ideas themselves do not have a race or a gender. They are simply ideas. And I think it's plainly obvious that ideas have far more power to change a nation than the ethnic composition of that nation does. The country of Japan is still ethnically Japanese, but it's specifically because the people have adopted ideas that came from the West that the country looks so different than it did prior to World War II. So I'd have to say that Lauren's claim that preserving a way of life is necessarily tied to preserving racial homogeneity is demonstrably false. Nations can and do experience radical change, primarily due to ideas, not race. Perhaps a more extreme example would be the nations of North and South Korea. Both these nations contain ethnically homogeneous populations descended from the same race, yet they look radically different. Why do you think that is?
My question is, what is more natural or basic a drive than to simply exist? Survival.
I totally agree. Survival is a basic drive. That's why all throughout history, we find that people of various races, cultures, and traditions who previously hated each other and wanted nothing to do with each other suddenly become allies when doing so is necessary for their survival. In fact, the Alt-Right's manifesto specifically calls upon various white races to put aside their historical differences to ensure the survival of the more broad white race.
Civic nationalism is so unnatural, and what Alex has just said, sorry about mixing up the words there. What Alex has just said is extremely unnatural because he does not wish to survive for his nation to survive. That is not a chip within his brain for his nation to survive. He doesn't care.
I think Alex's point is that his nation would be better off as a mixed-race society with the right ideas than as a homogenous one with the wrong ideas. Maybe you don't think such a society is possible due to some sort of genetic determinism, but Alex's point is that nations can and do change, and his nation stands to become better by having more people with the right ideas regardless of the ethnic background of those people.
He believes that as long as other nations that enter his state believe in the same things as he does, then his nation may dissipate, disappear, and he does not care for that. I wouldn't say that is actively suicidal because he does not wish for his race or his nation to, as far as I know, for them to disappear, or he's not actively trying to do that as far as I know, but it is sort of a passive suicidalness. Demographics is not an issue. Demographics is not a concern for a civic nationalist. As long as the people coming here claim to share a certain ideal, love for the Constitution maybe, then they are welcome.
Given that nations can and do change, whether they stay ethnically homogenous or not, I don't think that preserving a nation, or specifically a race, is inherently good or bad. The relevant question is, what sort of nation, race are we talking about? If I lived in an ethnically homogenous communist society, I would want to change it, or get out of that nation and let it learn its lesson by drowning in the inevitable failures of communism. Would this be an example of me being suicidal towards my people? I don't think so. Some nations aren't worth saving, and I'd say this is because of ideas they espouse, not the ethnicity of the people there. This is why I believe in meritocracy, not ethnic homogeneity. I think that a nation thrives based on the quality of the individuals that make it up, regardless of what ethnicity they are. I would agree with Lauren, and I believe Alex Jones would as well, that paying immigrants from other countries to move in and impose their culture on the local population is a bad idea, specifically if your culture is superior to theirs. That's why I do oppose mass government-enabled immigration incentivized by welfare. However, of all the time I've spent listening to the alt-right explain their position, it seems to me that their position comes down to, if you're not white, you don't belong here, even if you share our values and are prepared to positively contribute to society. I see no reason to think that this kind of policy would make the nation a better place, and it would require giving totalitarian power to the state to limit the free decisions of individuals.
Not only is civic nationalism not nationalism because they do not wish to necessarily preserve the nation, it is actually an opposing force to nationalism, much like fire and ice, except it is paper versus blood. Paper being the belief of the civic nationalist and blood of the nationalist.
And I'd still like to hear why blood is so much more significant than ideas. Or perhaps I should say, why is blood so much more significant than the quality of a person as an individual? As I said in my previous video on this subject, I'm convinced that this is one of the major reasons that Genghis Khan was so successful in his endeavors. He recognized that all the royal blood or distinguished lineage in the world did not in itself make a person competent. What mattered was the person's talent as an individual. So it is with a person's place in society. I'm far more concerned with whether or not a person is willing to contribute to society than whether or not they share a common ethnic heritage.
Now, the civic nationalist may say that an African man with English documents that was maybe born there, English legal documents, is an Englishman, and that's why I use the term paper. If they have the legal documents, they are an Englishman. Now, the nationalists, such as myself, would say an African man could never be an Englishman, ever. It doesn't matter if he has legal documents. Sure, he's a legal member of the state. Remember, state versus nation. The African man may be a member of the state. I recognize that. He's a legal citizen of that country. But he can never be a part of the nation, the people. That is inherited at birth.
Okay, now here's where I really have to take issue with Lauren's position. At first glance, it makes sense. I mean, a black man living in a population where most everyone is white tends to stand out. It's quite obvious to everyone that his genetic heritage is from somewhere other than England. However, consider what happens after a few generations. My mother, for example, is ethnically Norwegian, full-blooded. As far back as we can trace her family's lineage, everyone was Norwegian and only married other Norwegian people. However, it was her great-great-great-grandfather that immigrated with his family to the United States. Now, when I visit my mother's side of the family, everyone is just about as white and blonde as the people in Norway. But none of them speak a word of Norwegian. None of them have ever even visited Norway. They all hate lutefisk. I mean, are they Norwegian or American? Any significant ties to Norwegian identity have been lost. In the same way, consider how many blacks are living in the US, or maybe even Europe, whose ancestors haven't lived in Africa for at least 5 generations. In what sense are they African? Genetically, but that's about it. Further, if we go back far enough in history, you'll see that every nation in existence today was formed at one point by people relocating from another, different nation. My point is that national identities inevitably change over time. This can't be stopped, even if the gene pool in that particular region stays largely unchanged. Since by Lauren's own admission there's more to a nation than simply genes, it doesn't make sense to me that a person's ethnic heritage determines what nation they're a part of. If you have no connection to Africa other than your skin color, in what sense are you African?
Just as if I were to go to China for a few years and maybe I gain Chinese citizenship and I have my Chinese legal documents, I will never be Chinese.
But tell me, suppose you stay in China and your children and grandchildren are born and raised there. Assuming that they only speak Mandarin and China is the only home they've ever known, then in what sense will they be American? Further, odds are they just might marry Chinese people, furthering the assimilation. Well, it may be true that the initial generation who relocates will never lose a large part of their identity coming from their homeland. Over time, they're generally forced to assimilate. Now, it's different when hordes of people are rapidly relocated into a different country and get paid to do it. But as I already said, I oppose that.
China is usually an easier one for people to understand because China is having none of this multi-ethnic society.
Yeah, and China is a totalitarian state, which is why they aren't exactly doing great on the index of economic freedom or when it comes to political and civil liberties. There aren't exactly a lot of Chinese citizens speaking out on YouTube like Lauren is doing. This is generally my biggest beef with the alt-right. For the record, if you think that people are better off when they only associate with and breed with people of their own kind, however you define kind, then you're welcome to believe that, practice it, and preach it. However, you're never going to convince everyone. In a society with freedom of speech and freedom of association, you're going to have people of different races who voluntarily choose to associate with one another, maybe even getting married and having mixed-race kids. You're going to have people who want to move from one place to another when there's economic opportunity to do so. Therefore, how are you going to maintain ethnic integrity? Inevitably, you'll have to initiate force against people who are associating voluntarily. You'll have to use force to prevent people of different ethnicities from interbreeding. You'll have to use force to kick ethnic minorities who refuse to leave peacefully out of the country. All this use of force will have to be consolidated in a state, a totalitarian state, and that's the problem. Both the left and the alt-right require a totalitarian state to accomplish their ends. They just disagree about what the totalitarian state should do with its power. But remember, the same government that has the power to give you everything you want is a government that has the power to take everything you have.
They are very homogenous, and they understand, you understand, that I will never be Chinese. Sure, I might be a member of the state of China, but I'll never be Chinese, unfortunately. If they want to remain consistent, the civic nationalist must say that I am just as Chinese as a Chinese person, part of the Chinese nation. I am just as Chinese as they are. And the black man is just as English as any other Englishman, if they wish to remain consistent.
I really don't think that follows. Of course, I'm not really a civic nationalist either. I just believe that if people of different races want to voluntarily associate with one another, that's none of my business. I oppose mass unfettered immigration as it currently exists in Europe and the United States because the force of government is being used to make Americans and Europeans associate with people who don't want to assimilate. I oppose ethnically homogenous societies that remain as such because the government uses force to stop people who would otherwise voluntarily associate. Basically, I think the problem with both the left and the alt-right is that they want to try and use force to make everyone else see it their way.
Right? Well, if I were to be just as Chinese and he were to be just as English as either nation, then that would mean that identity does not exist. In-group preference does not exist. Heritable traits do not exist. They cannot exist if I am to be just as Chinese and he is to be just as English.
And I agree with that. All people are at least in some ways different from other people. To say otherwise is stupid, but it also doesn't follow that genetics inevitably link people to other people who they otherwise have nothing else in common with.
Now, ask anybody on the street if a black man should feel guilty for colonialism in Africa, and they will say no. You know what? Go do that, and let me know if you find somebody who says yes, because at least they're consistent. At least they are a consistent faux nationalist, right? Because they're saying that paper is stronger than blood, that black man is an Englishman, and therefore he should feel just as guilty as any other Englishman. At least they're consistent, right? I disagree, but... And why don't people believe that? Why don't they believe the black man should be guilty for colonialism? Well, it's because he's not a part of the English nation. He's not related to that nation by common birth and descent, which is a very important part. Ethnically, racially, he does not belong. If you are a nationalist like myself, you are nothing like the civic kind. I actually want German to remain German. I know, well, Germany to remain German, that is. I know it's so, it's very controversial to say so. I want Japan to remain Japanese. Oh my gosh, what am I saying? Do I want people to start attacking me now as a racist? It's like they haven't been already. But the civic nationalist does not agree. They don't agree that Japan should remain Japanese or that Germany should remain German. It's just not a concern of their own. You know, as long as the Somalians heading into Sweden love Swedish culture, I really don't have a problem with it. Now, the simple way to determine whether or not someone is a nationalist or a faux nationalist is you ask them, are you concerned with preserving the ethnicity or race of your nation, of your people? And that's it. If they are, they might be a nationalist.
Well, here's what I have to say. I think that left to their own devices, German people would probably choose to associate with other German people, for the most part. And that Japanese people would do the same, and that the same could probably be said for people of most races. The West is facing a crisis right now because governments are using their power to force diversity. People from third world countries are being told, hey, come over here and we'll give you a fat welfare check and a place to live, no need to worry about assimilating either. As a libertarian, I expressly oppose this. However, by the same token, I believe that individual freedom is far more important than any collective, and therefore if people of different races want to voluntarily associate with one another, that's none of my business. And now, to my final point. For those alt-righters watching this, here's why I think you ought to consider adopting my position. If we had individual freedom in the West without state interference, then you would be free to only associate with other white people. You would be free to hang signs in your place of business that said, we only serve whites, no immigrants allowed. And you would be free to use force to defend yourself from trespassers on your own legitimately owned property. You'd be free to marry other white people and have white babies. In fact, if you're concerned that the white race is going to disappear, the only thing that's going to stop this ultimately is if more white people start having white babies. However, think about the society that the alt-right envisions, where the state has the power to use force to maintain ethnic integrity. This is a form of collectivism, where the well-being of the white race is more important than any individual's freedom. But the problem with any form of collectivism is that once the collective is more important than the individual, there is no limit to the abuses against individuals that can take place in the name of the collective. What happens when the state comes to your door and says, we did some research and it turns out that your great-great-great-grandmother was Jewish. You don't belong in our society. Get out. Now, you can say that's extreme and it won't happen, but the state will, at least in principle, have to have that kind of power in order to make the ethno-state the alt-right envisions exist. The same government that has the power to give you everything you want is a government that has the power to take everything you have. The answer is not ethno-nationalism. It's freedom. And that is my 2 cents. Take it for what it's worth.
There are too many minorities. Too many at my waterfall. So change our priorities and get all these minorities out of my water park.
Thanks everyone for watching. If you liked this video, please hit like and subscribe. You can also hit the bell to ensure you're notified every time I upload a new video. This video was made possible by my patrons. If anyone else would like to donate and help ensure that I have the time and resources to keep putting out content, for just $1 a month on Patreon or Maker Support, you'll receive your name listed in the end credits and the link to one of your social media platforms listed in the description. You can also support the channel by purchasing my 2 cents merchandise or checking out my Amazon affiliate links. To follow me on Twitter, minds.com, BitChute, WordPress, Gab, or iTunes, check out the links in the description. Uploads are every Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday, so stay tuned for more videos.